Well, hey there, we're back. So we've just finished off a very, very long series on the life of Jesus, 14 weeks in fact. Now, I had no expectation that it would have taken that long. In fact, I was thinking of doing that series last year, maybe over 4 weeks. And anyway, turns out very differently. But as a part of that series, I was actually going to do maybe a week of discussion about the sources for Jesus' life. So obviously the Gospels. But as the series started to expand and evolve, I thought maybe I'll just separate those and talk about them as a separate issue. So what I wanted to begin this week, and we certainly won't take 14 weeks to do this. This will be a much shorter series, maybe 2 to 3 weeks, but then who knows? My guesses tend to be pretty useless, but I thought we'd do a couple of weeks on the Gospels themselves. And so this is obviously an important topic because these are our primary sources for the life of Jesus. There are the foundations on which our New Testaments are made and really the foundations of the Christian faith. And so they warrant at least a little bit of time spent discussing them. In the series I did last year when I was looking at the life of Paul, I was looking also at his letters and how those letters evolved from his life and the story behind each of those letters based on where they were written within the context of what Paul was doing throughout his missionary endeavors. So anyway, that was a series we did last year. You can certainly go and check that out. But at the very least, the Gospels deserve a little bit of time in discussion. And where I want to sort of get to after this series is to pick up our story again after the life of Jesus. So where I want to take for maybe a couple of months is the story of Jesus leading into the church and looking at the church for the first maybe couple of hundred years and how this story was taken out into the world and what impact it had. Really, I mean, we know the impact that it had because we're still talking about it today. I mean, here we are doing this podcast. But how the Christian message or the life of Jesus, this obscure preacher from Galilee, how did him and his message, how did they end up going all the way to Rome and then eventually conquering Rome? How do we go from, the little backwater village of Nazareth to the point where the emperor Constantine embraces this message, this Christian faith as the faith of the empire? How does that actually happen? Because it really is a remarkable story, and look at some of the key developments along the way. So anyway, we'll get to that. So we'll pick up that series in a few weeks. But again, in the meantime, just wanted to take a little bit of time just to look at the Gospels and hopefully give you maybe a bit of a deeper understanding as to what they are, why they are, can we trust them, and all of these important questions. So to begin this series, I thought I'd do something a little bit different. I'm not normally the type to do one of those response videos, the ones you see where they'll put a clip of somebody else's podcast or show or something, and then the host will respond to it. And there's a lot of value in those, and I find them quite interesting as well. I like to hear the different perspectives on the different opinions. It's not something I've really ever explored, but I just thought for this one, it might be interesting to bring a clip in from another podcast to just sort of get a sense or sort of articulate what is, I guess, a more general perception about the Gospels. So the clip itself is taken from the Joe Rogan podcast. It's a favorite of mine. And this was an episode that came on a couple of weeks ago. And the lady that he's interviewing on this particular episode, she'd grown up in a cult. So from birth, she'd been in this small cult in the US and had grown up for the first, up until her teenage years, really just not knowing the outside world. It's one of these sort of typical stories you hear coming out of these cults. And what got her excommunicated from her group and ultimately from her family that had raised her in this cult was that she went and saw a movie with a boy. So she was sort of in her late teens when this happened. And this wasn't just a no-no. This was absolutely forbiddable behavior. You just simply don't go to the movies. But she went to the movies and they found out about it. And she eventually they excommunicated her from this particular community, which, I guess listening to her account of it, it was the best thing that could have possibly happened to her. But it's one of those fascinating stories, a very sad story as well. It's certainly worth the listen. But obviously in a conversation like that, you're going to you're going to eventually venture into the different religions. And, when you're an outsider looking into religion, and, you'll sort of hear this said about Christianity that, oh, it's just another cult. It's just another, like any of these other cults, like Scientology or, Mormonism or whatever, you name it, they're all one and the same thing. They're all just sort of these cultic sort of ideas. And so naturally the conversation in this particular episode led into Christianity and Jesus, of course, as the founding figure of the Christian faith. And what they say about Jesus and the Gospels, I wouldn't say it's informative because it's something you've probably heard said before in some form. But again, it's just interesting to articulate or to have articulated what the general argument against the Gospels or against the Christian faith would be. So anyway, I won't keep talking about it. Here's the clip and have a listen and then we'll talk about it afterwards.
Jesus as a historical figure is controversial. There's people that say that there's absolute evidence for Jesus, but then there's people that say, do you know how much historical record we have on people that lived thousands of years before Jesus? There's people that lived that they know what they said, they know where they ate, they know where they went, they know so much about them. But the Jesus one is kind of, there's people that say yes, there's historical documents that show he existed. And then there's a bunch of documentaries that you can watch that boy, the evidence is kind of sketchy. It seems to be a thought, like a recurring thing in many religions. It seems to be like Hercules, right? It seems to be there's a bunch of these that are real similar to that, like the child of a god, that comes down to fix everything.
There's a lot of traditions where you have a virgin birth. That is true. And I am certainly not here to tell anybody what is true or not true, but the Gospels that are written about Jesus were written after, right? Not during. And that was, common. I mean, Socrates never wrote anything down. He told the stories to Plato.
And how long after his death?
Well, I think the first one, now I feel like I am not a historian here, but I think the first one was 100 years.
Now, it's a conversation, as you gathered, and so it's a little bit rambly. It's not articulate. It's not a sort of pre-formed discussion. They'll just sort of, shoot in the breeze talking about Jesus and the Gospels. And so it's not a clearly formulated thoughts, particularly from Joe's side of things. But there's a couple of interesting points that were raised in it. And I want to, just spend this series addressing the core of what these issues are. There's two main issues that get raised throughout this, and really two issues around the Gospels themselves. The first one is the historical reliability of them. And this really pertains to the dating of them, when they were written. And what she's sort of suggesting here is they were written at least 100 years after the life of Jesus. That's some sort of shocking thing. Now, we're going to address that because it's actually a wrong piece. It's actually false. They were written earlier than 100 years, but even 100 years for ancient documents written about an ancient figure is pretty normal, actually. That's quite early when you consider the dating of the historical documents we have about guys like Alexander, for example. The earliest information we have about Alexander the Great comes centuries after his life. So 100 years actually isn't a long time, but it's actually less than that when we come to the Gospel. So there's the historical reliability of them in the sense of, well, they weren't written by Jesus' followers while he was still alive, therefore we can't trust them. Well, that wasn't true really for any ancient document. And so the Gospels in coming after Jesus were pretty usual, pretty standard sort of thing. Anyway, we will come to that. But then the other issue that it raises is the trustworthiness of them. The fact that they were written by his followers would take away the credibility of them because, well, they're going to make up stories or they're going to exaggerate the stories about Jesus and make him out to be much more than what he actually was, because they're trying to start this cult that is going to be, well, I don't even know what they're trying to gain from it because they all got killed for it. So if they had sinister motives, they weren't very good because they actually all got killed for declaring this message. So whatever their reasons might be, they've exaggerated the story, turned Jesus into a god, and so therefore, we can't trust them because it's only from his mates that wrote the story down, etc., etc. So these are sort of the two key issues is the historical reliability and the trustworthiness of the accounts themselves. Can we trust that the stories we find within them are not just some exaggerated fantasies made up later on by his loyal followers, like some cults that's been entranced by their false teacher? So I guess I want to sort of spend the time addressing these two main issues and just sort of see what's really going on, I guess, when we come to the Gospels themselves. Now, to the first question of the historical reliability, I don't want to spend much time on that. Instead, what I want to do is actually point you to another excellent podcast that came out only just a couple of weeks ago that actually deals with this really well. It's by John Dixon. You might have come across it. It's the podcast Undeceptions. And he does a fantastic interview with Simon Gathercole, who's a British New Testament scholar and a world authority on this particular topic. All of his publications, his books have all been around the Gospels themselves and their historical reliability. And so I've put the link for that in the notes because I think they're going to do so much of a better job. John Dixon, his playground is the Gospels. He was a graduate of Macquarie University, where I came from as well, and this is just his field, is the Gospels and their reliability. So I'll put the link for that in the notes if you want to sort of follow that up after this episode and really sort of go into the historical or the details around the historical transmission and the creation of the Gospels themselves. So here are a couple of genuine experts about that who are going to do a much better job than I will. So I'll point you to that, but only to say about the historical reliability or what the questions around that sort of imply. What the suggestion is that if they were written so much later, then the stories themselves was sort of evolved over time, the accusation or the charge based on that is that they don't give us any sort of account of the original life. When you write something down 100 years later, well, the people who are writing it down had no idea who Jesus is because they lived much after his time. Nobody's a reliable eyewitness. And so what do they know? How can they possibly know an accurate account of the life of Jesus? They're too far from the source himself, and so therefore we can't trust what they have to say because, well, what they've got is stories that have expanded and exaggerated and been blown up over the generations, and so therefore, again, we can't trust anything from them because they're not the original sources. They weren't straight from the mouth of Jesus. They weren't written down by Jesus or written down during his lifetime. Therefore, they're not trustworthy. And I guess within that, what it also implies is that they're not trustworthy because they're written by his followers, but they're written by people who've, very cynically been sucked into the cult. And so they're just going to tell the best version of the story that's been passed down to them, which isn't a true version of the story to begin with. So you get what I'm saying. Like there's the fact that there's such a distance between is going to lend itself to all sorts of exaggerations. And so there's nothing we can trust about them. And, even if Jesus did exist, there's nothing we can learn about him that's of any reliable or any validity. So really, maybe he existed, but we don't know anything about him anyway because whatever has been said about him has all been made up. That's the most cynical reading that you're going to get from, again, this accusation that the Gospels came much, much later on. Now, as we're going to see through the series, is that the dating that they're beginning with is actually incorrect, that the dating of the Gospels is much, much closer to Jesus' life. And because of that, and sort of as part of that, is that the sources themselves actually are people who were with Jesus. They were direct sources from people who were there with Jesus. Now, you might say, well, maybe they still made up the story. Well, actually, no, because we've got plenty of sort of evidence to suggest that, no, actually, these are very, very reliable accounts. So anyway, we're going to come back to that through the series. But the other sort of accusation or the other sort of question that gets raised coming from this is, well, then the only information we have is written from his followers. And so how can we trust it? Because it's just his mates or people that are part of his cult that are writing down the story. You know, again, they're just going to tell their own polished, their own exaggerated version of the story. Now, this is true in the sense that the only information we have about Jesus is from the four Gospels, but that's exactly what we would expect. Jesus himself, certainly within the first 200 to 300 years of after his life, Jesus had an impact, but only on his followers. He's not Caesar. Caesar changed the world. Caesar ran the empire, and so every single person in the Roman Empire is being impacted by his life. So anybody could have written an account about the Caesar or about the way that he impacted their lives, and that would be, it would be sort of an external source. We might look at that and say that's a bit more trustworthy because it's written by somebody who wasn't a follower of Caesar. In fact, you might say that if it was somebody who was opposed to Caesar, that's probably more reliable because it's not somebody who's writing through, rainbow-colored eyes, if that's even what I'm trying to say there. It's not written by somebody who's just trying to paint him in the best light. We actually want to hear from people apart from the group. Well, Jesus didn't have that impact. Jesus was Jesus and he was the head of this new Christian movement. But apart from the Christian movement, nobody cared about Jesus. They just didn't care. In fact, they probably didn't know about him. So why would they write about him? Why would we have sources apart from his followers about Jesus? Again, when nobody would have cared about him. He wasn't anything. He wasn't any sort of important figure, and certainly in his own lifetime. I've heard the accusation made in the past that, if Jesus was so important, then why don't we have any sources from his time, from guys like Philo? Philo, the very famous Jewish philosopher and author, writing sort of in the time of Paul. Why doesn't he write anything about Jesus? It was like, well, Philo probably didn't know about him. Jesus was around at the sort of within the lifetime of Philo, but why would Philo care about him? Because he didn't know anything about him. So why would he write anything about him? I mean, there were plenty of Jewish teachers in Philo's time that he doesn't mention. Jesus, as far as Philo was concerned, was of the same consequence. None. So, of course, he's not going to mention him. Like, this is exactly what we would expect. And the same reason why don't you, yourself, listening to this, write down stories of absolutely everybody on the planet in case they're important? Like, well, no, you're not going to do that because why? So, of course, we're not going to find accounts of Jesus outside of his group because, again, no one cares. So what we do know about Jesus comes from his followers because they're the only ones that cared enough to write the stories down because for them, the stories were important. So, yes, we have the stories from them. And so, again, does this diminish the credibility of them? Does this mean that we can't trust the Gospels because it was written down by his biased followers? Well, yes, it was written down by his biased followers, but it doesn't actually undermine the credibility, again, for reasons we're going to see throughout this series. Okay, so there was one more point that she sort of referred to in this dialogue. She mentioned Paul. She talked about him as being probably our most reliable source because at least Paul saw Jesus in a very obscure way, whereas the other gospel authors didn't see Jesus, so therefore we can't trust them because Paul was the only one that did see him. Now, again, we're going to come back to the other sources and whether or not they saw Jesus. It's just not true, but when it comes to Paul himself, it's interesting that she mentioned Paul. It's a very important point, but she didn't elaborate on the point at all. Yes, Paul saw Jesus in an obscure way, but what she doesn't mention actually is that there is an account in Paul's letters, specifically in 1 Corinthians, that gives a really good starting point for our, the trustworthiness of the Gospels. So the point I'm talking about specifically, it's a passage that Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 15. Now, what had been happening in the Corinthian church is that they've got all of these moral issues that are going on there. There's a lot of compromise going on in their faith. They've sort of come into the Christian community, but really they're not acting out the values of the community. And what is really at the foundation of a lot of the issues in Corinth is a false or a wrong understanding of the afterlife. In standard ancient Greek thinking, there is an afterlife, but what that looks like is that we die and our physical body goes back to dust, because you've seen plenty of dead bodies, they've seen plenty of dead bodies, and they know what happens to a dead body. It rots away. And so there's no concept of a physical resurrection. That sort of idea is just absolutely absurd, because we've seen what happens to the physical body. But what we also notice is that the soul of the body disappears. The fact that a body goes cold and that it doesn't breathe anymore is because the soul has exited the body. So the soul is hot, it's air, it's pneuma, which is air, it's spirit, it's gas. And so when that leaves the body, the heat of the body goes out, as well as the life of the body. And so where has it gone? Well, that's gone into eternity, because you can't destroy air. You can't destroy a spirit, because it's indestructible. And so it will go off into the afterlife. And so the point of that, or the moral outworking of that, is that when if your soul leaves your body, if that's the only part that's eternal, then what you do with your body is of no consequence. If I want to, whatever I want to do with my body, it doesn't have any eternal consequence, and it's separate from my soul. My soul is not impacted at all by my bodily actions, because, well, they're two separate things. So the soul exits and leaves the body behind, and so whatever I've done with my body, again, is of no eternal consequence. So this idea has infused the Corinthian Christians, and, well, it hasn't infused it, they've just brought it to their faith. And rather than Paul's teaching, which is of a bodily resurrection, which has a different set of moral implications, what we do with our body is of no consequence. And so we find the Corinthians engaged in sexual immorality and all of these other behaviors that Paul absolutely condemns. Now, that's actually an aside. It's not the point that I want to talk about. The point that Paul sort of begins with in this account is to remind them of the gospel that he passed down to them in the first place. And within that gospel is the account of Jesus' life, most importantly, his bodily resurrection. Now, what does this have to do with the gospels? Well, we'll sort of see that in a moment, but let's look at the passage itself, beginning in Corinthians 15:1, and sort of set it into its historical context, but then show the importance of why it is as a part of early church tradition. So 15:1, it says, "Now, brothers and sisters, I want to remind you of the gospel I preached to you, which you received and on which you have taken your stand." So he's referring back to what he first told them when he was in Corinth. All right, so that's important, because it gives us some dates for this particular account that he's reminded them of. So the letter itself is written in 54 AD. Now, if we can date Jesus's crucifixion to about 33 or 34, so about 20 years after the death of Jesus, we have this account being reiterated by Paul to the Corinthian church. But that's not the first time they've heard it, because Paul says, "I want to remind you of what I first passed on to you." When did he first pass it on to them? And that would have been when he was first in Corinth, which is about 50 AD. So let's go back 4 years, and about 16 years from the death of Jesus, Paul had passed on this tradition. Now, why did he pass it on to the Corinthians? Or what was the point of passing it on? Well, this tradition that he's passing on is the framework of the gospel that he would have had them memorize. So the fact that he passed it on to them as of first importance would suggest to us that that wasn't the first time he passed on that story. In fact, this was the foundation of all of Paul's gospel, was this particular tradition, which would suggest to us that he'd been doing that for all of his missionary work up until that point. So we can date that to a couple of years prior to 50, into the year 48, in that that's when Paul was starting to pass it on during his missionary endeavors into the Gentile world. Now, where did that tradition come from? Well, Paul didn't make it up. He received that. This is what he got from the church back in Jerusalem, which at the very latest would have taken place in about the year 47. So he talks in Galatians about a short visit that he made to the church in Jerusalem for about 13 days, and where he basically had his gospel message confirmed. He'd been preaching for a long time prior to that, since his conversion, really. And he'd been out doing a lot of this work apart from the 12 in Jerusalem. And so he goes back to Jerusalem, in part because there's been accusations made that Paul's preaching a wrong gospel. He's been out there preaching a different message to what's been preached in Jerusalem. And so it was something of a check-in. You know, it had been quite a few years since Paul's conversion. He'd been preaching to a lot of people. And he wasn't going there asking for permission to preach. He wasn't going to Jerusalem saying, oh, hey, guys, yeah, I thought I'd better just check with you to make sure that I'm allowed to do this. No, he's just going, oh, guys, by the way, just, incidentally, I just thought I'd let you know that this is what I've been preaching. As it turns out, the whole point of the meeting was to confirm that what he was preaching is exactly what they had been preaching, again, for the whole time since Jesus. And so what they have confirmed is this tradition. So this particular thing that Paul has been preaching is what he's been preaching his whole Christian life to this point, and what has been preached in Jerusalem. And so what that means is that this particular thing that I'm about to read here, but what Paul has preached here is something that has been part of the church tradition going back to at least 47, but with the obvious implication that it's been going on since Jesus' death. This particular sort of gospel summary is what the earliest message was. So from pretty much the day after Jesus' ascension, they have formulated this story, which is just an account of what they saw. This is what they have come to agree to and believe about the life of Jesus. And so this is what they have been passing on ever since then, what they've been getting people to memorize. So this, again, you're wondering what the point of the story is, what this account is. But what this account is a framework of the gospel message that had been preached since day one, basically since the very beginning. And this is the story that had been going out. So what is the story? We'll read it out and then we can unpack it a little bit more. So beginning in verse 2, it says, "By this gospel you are saved if you hold firmly to the word I preached to you. Otherwise you've believed in vain. For what I received, I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas and then to the 12. After that he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James and to all the apostles, and last of all he appeared to me also, as to one abnormally born." So from the very earliest time since Jesus' death, this story had been formulated that Jesus had died, and he died on a Roman cross. Now, that fact alone is trustworthy because, as we saw in the series last time, we have that account from other Roman historians as well. Specifically, we have it from Josephus and we have it from Tacitus, who both confirm that there was a guy by the name of Jesus who was crucified on a Roman cross. So that point can be verified by other sources as well. That story was commonly known. Jesus was a teacher in Jerusalem or in Judea and Galilee who was crucified on a Roman cross. That much is absolutely certain. And so that part is formulated within the story from the earliest point. But then that not just that he died, but that he was buried and that he was risen again after 3 days. Now, whether or not you believe in the resurrection is beside the point. The fact is that part of the story was being told from the very beginning. And that's really what they were coming after. In the earliest, and we see this in Acts, they were trying to make up or the authorities were trying to discredit that point of the story. No one could deny that Jesus died on the cross because everybody had seen it. What they were trying to discredit was the resurrection. Now, again, I'm not here to prove whether or not the resurrection actually happened. The point is that's what they were saying. Now, I say that because the Gospels came 100 years afterwards and we can't trust them. What's at the core of that argument is that much, much, much later on, at least 100 years down the track, they started to add to the story that there was a resurrection. that Jesus came back to life. They added that just to spice the story up, to give him more authority, to make him more like a god. But really, he was just a normal man, like every other man. And when he died, he stayed dead. But what the disciples tried to do was to spice it up and make it more powerful, make Jesus seem like more of a god. But as we can see from this, that key detail of Jesus' resurrection was a part of the story from the absolute earliest times. From day one, this was a central component to the story. It wasn't added later on. It was absolutely essential. So why have I've just drawn our attention to this particular passage because it gives us the basic framework of the gospel, the key details that Jesus lived, that he died, that he was buried, and that he was resurrected. What the gospel accounts tell us in much more detail are an expansion of this basic framework, which had been part of the church tradition from the absolutely earliest point. So what that at least tells us something of is that what we find in the Gospels, at least as a framework, is accurate in the sense that this is what they had always understood to be true from the earliest times, and that the accounts themselves are, well, something of an accurate reflection of what the people who first saw him or were with him had experienced. So that really just sort of leaves the question. Now, again, if you go back and check out that other episode that I mentioned from a couple of weeks ago, looking at the historical reliability and how these Gospels were physically passed on and how they were created and transmitted. We don't need to spend a whole episode on that. Go and have a listen to that other episode, which was excellent. So we've got the framework. That's an important detail. We have the basic framework that we find in the Gospels is part of the story that had been transmitted from the very beginning. And so then the question has to be asked, what about the rest of the information? Okay, that's a few verses. Now, one more important point that Paul makes there in that passage, he refers to these 500 other people. He says, all these 500 other people saw the resurrected Jesus. Now, again, whether or not you want to believe in the resurrection, the fact that Paul can point to these other witnesses is because it's saying they're still around. Some of them have fallen asleep, he admits, but many of them are still alive. And so don't just take my word for it. Go and ask them. Go and ask the people that Jesus appeared to, not just the disciples, but James, the brother who became the head of the church, and others beside him. But then all of these other eyewitnesses who were there. Now, why would you mention them if they weren't people you wanted to talk to? Like you would say, oh no, just go and ask Peter. He was the only one that saw it because, we're trying to, because if we're making this up, we want to keep the minimum amount of witnesses who've all agreed on the story. No, there's like 500 random people that saw it. Go and ask those guys as well. So they were confident, at least in their assertions, that what this tradition was about was true at the very least. So anyway, what about the stories themselves? What about the content of the Gospels? Again, the framework is there, but there's a lot of stuff going on in the Gospels. What is all of that? And importantly, can we trust it? It came from somewhere. And so, again, if the Gospels have been written much later on, then surely they just made all of this up. Or even if some of it did stem back to the mouth of Jesus himself, again, can we trust it? The other argument that's made on that podcast, the Joe Rogan one I talked about, but it's another one that sort of gets thrown around is, well, it's like Chinese whispers. Jesus told a story to his disciples and they passed it on. And as it gets passed on, it gets exaggerated, it gets transformed and changed and all the rest of it. How can we rely on any of these stories if they've been passed down through the generations? Well, again, we'll sort of unpack, probably focus more of that as we go through this series. All right, so to start with then, let's quickly address the dating issue, and I'll come into a bit more detail later on in sort of next week after, the actual specific dating or the best guess of dating that we can find for the individual Gospels. Only to say at this point that where scholars tend to estimate, the range of dates they tend to estimate for the Gospels is somewhere between the four Gospels. They tend to date them between about 70 to 100 AD. Now, the 70, the earliest Gospel is Mark. Now, it could actually even be dated a little bit earlier than that, but 70 is about the average of where scholars will date that particular gospel. And this is generally agreed. This is the generally agreed date of Mark. You won't find too many people who'll say otherwise. And so this is a fairly reliable sort of upper date for that. Now, 70 sounds late, but that's only 40 years after the life of Jesus. In other words, it's within the lifetime of people who would have seen Jesus. So that narrows it down from 100 years, as has been suggested on our on Joe Rogan. We bring it back by 60 years down to 40 years after the life of Jesus, which is really quite extraordinary. When you consider that, for example, the earliest accounts we have of the life of Julius Caesar or of Augustus are actually over 100 years after their lives. So this is very significant to have such an early account, and very, very almost unprecedented, in fact, to have such an early account of his life. So the earliest gospel that we date is Mark, and that in fact becomes, as we're going to see, becomes the basis for the other gospels. So they recognize its authority as the earliest sort of authorized document, and so therefore that becomes kind of the framework for other gospels afterwards. But even the other gospels are dated only 15 years later, somewhere in the 80s. So at the latest, sort of maybe 50 years after. Now, even if you want to extend that out to maybe 100 AD, the absolute upper limit of late 90s, 100, we're still talking within, say, 65 years of Jesus' life. So certainly far less than the 100 that we talk about. And then the question might be asked, well, that still feels late, right? The life of, even 40 years feels late. Well, it does for us because, again, we live in a world which has real-time accounts. In a social media world, we know what people are doing as they're doing it. We've got this thing called live streaming, where you can quite literally project your life around the world live, digitally. So we think in those terms where, unless we're watching it in real time, it doesn't exist almost. Like, even a day later seems like a long time. Go back 2,000 years, 40 years is a very, very, very short time indeed. So that's an important point. But even then you might say, well, then why did they take so long to write anything down? Well, in part, that's because they were living in an oral tradition, which we'll talk about in a moment. But the other key point to keep in mind is that throughout the course of the early church, they thought Jesus was coming back. In fact, this was what was really driving the apostles in the first place, and especially Paul. We actually see this coming through in Paul's letters, is this expectation that Jesus is coming back imminently. He could be back by the weekend. We may not even see tomorrow. Jesus could come back at any moment. See, when Jesus, as far as they understood, resurrected and was ascended, he sort of gave this idea that, well, this generation won't pass away until they see my return. They're like, all right, we're going to take that literally. And they're fully expecting that Jesus would return. And so there's no time to sit there and write down and argue over theology, spend the many, many, many months that it would take, not just to write down the account, but then to transmit it, to spread it out and to confirm it with all of the other Christian communities. That wasn't the priority, because the people that were talking about the story were the ones that had seen Jesus. The Gospels were, as we're going to see, first confirmed, standardized, I guess. The stories about Jesus were sort of standardized by the 12, and then from them, they were transmitted out into the world. So the teachers like Paul who were going out would check in on the 12, like what Paul did back in 47, confirm that his message lined up with the traditional, with the true message, or with the one that had been agreed on, and that he took that message out himself. So they were doing it verbally in an oral culture where only 5% of the population can read anyway. There's not a lot of point writing this stuff down because no one's going to be able to read it anyway. What we need to do is to go and preach it, because that's how people learn. We're talking about a culture where you do learn through hearing, you learn through memorization. So there's a whole lot of reasons why you don't bother writing this thing down straight away, because number one, most people can't read it anyway, and the time it's going to take to write it down and to send it out is time wasted from actually just going out there and doing the work, because Jesus is coming back tomorrow. We need to get this message out as quickly as possible, because Jesus is coming back tomorrow, as I keep saying, and we need to have as many people aware of the message before that time happens. So that was what was driving them. their whole missionary work was driven by the fact that Jesus was imminently going to return. So therefore, we have to just get this message out as quickly as possible. But then after a few years, after a few decades, they're like, hang on a second, Jesus hasn't come back yet. Hello, maybe he's forgotten about us. And the disciples are starting to get old, right? Some of them are even dying. Some of them have been martyred by that point. James has already been martyred. Some of the others have already been martyred. And so they're like, well, maybe we need to prepare for the eventuality that maybe we all die. And so then we don't have any original eyewitness accounts of the Gospels. We don't, the people that are telling the story don't have any original sources to be able to go back to and confirm their story. Remembering that all of this has been done verbally at the time. Now, what the stories are, again, I keep saying we're going to keep coming back to this. We are going to keep coming back to this. But what they are preaching, the source from where they're getting this message, the disciples are starting to die off. And so what we need to do is to get a final account, or get a formalized account, a written account from them, so that effectively we're sort of getting out of their heads what they know, and that way we've got an account, we've got a record that we can then hold on to for however long we have to be here till Jesus comes back. So what the Gospels really were was a way of preserving the stories that were already memorized by the people who had seen Jesus. And so they are written down by the followers, by the recipients of these original disciples, by the sort of from the schools that have emerged from these original teachers. What we're getting in these Gospels is an account from written by the students of the teachers, but the teachers, again, being the people who had actually seen Jesus himself. Now, just as a little bit of an anecdote, I guess, and I'll come back to this story later on as well. Just very recently, my wife's grandfather passed away. Now, it was a really sad story. He was in his 90s, so it wasn't like he died suddenly. He'd lived a good life. But really importantly, he'd spent his career, his whole career had been in the Australian Army. And so he joined the Army back in the 50s. He served in Korea, did 2 tours of Vietnam, went to Malaysia. He served in a lot of the conflicts that were happening sort of through the middle of the 20th century. And naturally, as you would expect, someone like him has absolutely incredible stories, incredible anecdotes that really just are stories that you'll never hear again. Stories that you even from people within his generation would not have any of the experiences that he had, let alone the generations like ours that have come after him that just don't have any experience of that kind of war. And so the stories were fascinating. And for the years that I sort of knew him, from the time I started dating my wife, I'd hear all of these stories, these great anecdotes, and they were stories that were just too good to lose. You can't lose these incredible stories that he was from this guy's life. The problem was they were all in his head, right? Even though as true as the stories were, they were all up in his head, and he passed on those stories. He told and retold these stories to his kids and to anyone that would listen. And so everyone sort of had a few of the anecdotes, and they'd sort of heard their own versions of the stories. But all of those would have been lost when he died, obviously, because they were all in his head. They were all up, they weren't made up, but you understand what I mean. And so a few years ago, I wrote down his book. I wrote the biography of his life so that I could capture those stories from the guy who'd seen them firsthand, from the mouth of the horse. I wanted those stories to be preserved for the generations to come afterwards, and obviously, especially for his family, that when he passes on, that these stories won't be lost. They won't be forgotten because they've gone with him. So I wrote this book down. I did that a few years ago, and so it was so pertinent a couple of weeks ago when I was at his funeral, just to be reminded of, it was so good to have had that opportunity to be able to write these stories down, because they'll be able to live on. And so, in fact, some of the stories became anecdotes in the funeral itself. It became some of the facts and details in that account kind of informed some of the things that were said at his funeral, because again, they were straight from him. These were his stories that were being transmitted. So I use that as an example because it's something like what these disciples are doing when they're writing the Gospels later on. They're seeing guys like Peter getting old and, their time is almost up. Well, when you die, what's in your head, that's going to go with you. We need to write this stuff down. So anyway, all of that to say, this is why the Gospels were written seemingly so much later, because for the years leading up to that, there's no need to write this stuff down. Again, very few people could have read it anyway, but importantly, we don't need to write it down when we've got the source right there. We've got the people who saw this story through their own eyes. We can just go and talk to them and hear the stories directly. So that's something then to the dating, at least to deal with the first sort of key misinformation, I guess, that we saw in that interview, that they were written 100 years after the life of Jesus. No, in fact, they weren't. They were written much earlier than that, and with still late, I guess, by our standards, but very early for their time, and within or just after the life of the people who first had that account. So that's a very important starting point that we need to recognize for understanding these Gospels. But again, go and listen to that other podcast that I mentioned from John Dixon. It's an excellent sort of account or historical sort of analysis of the historical reliability of the Gospels themselves. But for now, for this week, we'll sort of finish up all that by way of a starting point, I guess, of where we're going to go with this. So starting next week, then, we'll start to look at what these Gospels actually are. How are they created, who wrote them, why were they written? All of these will start to unpack and eventually look at all the Gospels individually. Like, what are the differences between them? There's 4 of them, and in some ways they read like the same story, but there are very important differences. What are those differences? Why do we have those differences? So anyway, that's what we'll spend the next couple of weeks looking at. But for now, thank you so much for joining me. Have a great week, and I will see you next week.